Hello, everyone, and especially hello to our RCIA participants and all of our team leaders and anyone who might be joining us for tonight's RCIA session. I apologize. This was supposed to be the first meeting that we had back in person in the church, and I was planning on doing this lesson with you in the church, but unfortunately I am on self-quarantine because I was exposed to someone who later, or I was around someone who later tested positive to coronavirus. So I've been exposed to coronavirus and have to go on a 14-day quarantine. The good news is that I'm not symptomatic, I don't believe. I feel fine, and I've even been tested and tested negative, but our policy is that I still remain away from everybody until the quarantine period is over and the window of danger, if you will, is over. So I'm doing okay, as I said, and thank you for your flexibility. We'll meet virtually tonight, and then Deacon Paul and Nick Martin will let you know what we're going to do for next week and the weeks to come. So tonight we're going to talk about salvation history, and this is basically a lesson in which we go through the Old Testament and we look at the key events in the Old Testament which get us from the creation of mankind, the creation of Adam and Eve, to the birth of Jesus, which get us to where we are now in the church. We'll have another session on church history to start from Jesus until 2020, but I think salvation history is important for us to give us a backdrop and a theological understanding of what we believe about the human race, about God as creator, and where we are and how we got here in relationship with God. So again, we're going to go through the Old Testament sort of like a history book, with the understanding that these aren't necessarily meant to be interpreted as straight historical events, but rather as key moments in human history in which things are represented in a narrative in order to give us theological principles and theological things that we can learn about ourselves and about God. If you want to look at the handout and follow along on that, I'll be using this structure of going of talking about, from God's gradual expansion of his covenant from a couple to a family to a tribe to a kingdom. We'll be talking about that. So you can follow along on the handout if you'd like. And otherwise, this is just sort of a nice summary, I think, of the Old Testament, of the narrative, so that when we talk about Christ and the church, and especially Jesus himself, we can put it in the context of the world to which he came and what the Jewish people believed about this coming Messiah. So first, let's talk about creation itself. Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning, when God created the world. The important thing here to remember is not so much that we believe that God created the world in seven 24-hour days, but rather that God created the world from nothing. That's the important part here. Science tells us it took billions of years from the Big Bang, from the creation of the cosmos to the world, to the earth, to be in such a condition that the human race could be created. And that's not really what we're talking about right now. What we're talking about is God is creator. God created everything, all the laws of physics, the physical world, from nothing. And he put the human race within that world. Specifically within the cosmos on earth, and that humanity was meant to be the crown of creation. Humanity is the most important thing that God has created, meaning that everything else was given to the human race to be to live in and be masters of, to be in harmony with nature, to be in harmony with one another, and to be in harmony with God. And in fact, we're told that humankind were created in God's image, meaning that we have an intellect and we have a will, and that unlike the animals, that we were called to a special relationship. We can know him with our intellect, and we can choose to love him with our will. Now that's how things were meant to be, and that's how things started in Eden, in paradise. The rest of this story is the story of sin, of how it entered in, and then the gradual development to salvation, to the undoing of sin. So let's talk about the original sin, because this is really the first big important thing here. Adam and Eve were created in a state of grace, in a state of perfect unity with each other and with nature and with God. They were created not to die. God would have sustained them to be immortal, and they were created not to suffer and not to have to be in conflict with themselves or with the world. By this point, when God had created the physical world and all within it, he had also created the supernatural world, if you will, the realm of the angels. Angels also have an intellect and a will, but they don't have a body. Angels are purely spiritual beings. And we believe that many of the angels, at the moment of their creation, when they understood all that God was going to do, they chose to turn against him. And instead of being his mediators, the beings that would bring his messages to the world, to humankind, and his grace to the world, those that turned against him, which we now call demons, led by their, the first to turn, the devil, those then began to work against God's plan. And we see this in the story of creation in tempting Adam and Eve. The reason the angels fell was pride. There's a famous quote that's given to Satan from a book called Paradise Lost, which is, it's better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. And the point there is that for the angels, pride told them that they, the creature, should be like the creator, should rule, and they shouldn't have to serve him. Pride, then, is also what caused the downfall of the human race. Adam and Eve, and it's represented by eating an apple, which they were told not to eat, which would make them like God. But the point here is that Adam and Eve joined the fallen angels in the sense of rebelling against God. And at that moment, original sin, and this is what we call the original sin, when they both chose to turn from God, to eat the apple, and then to turn to pride, to become like God, like the creator, instead of realizing they were the creature and that God, and that they could be in union with him. At that moment, sin enters into the cosmos. Sin enters into the world. Our relationship with nature and the world is broken. Our relationship, so that it becomes difficult to live on earth, that you have to work for your food and cultivate the earth so that it's possible to sustain yourself and to be shielded from nature, those things, in shelter and all that. And the relationship with each other becomes broken. And we'll see this in the progression of sin. We're only in the 3rd chapter of Genesis. The first chapter is creation. The second chapter talks about the Garden of Eden. The 3rd chapter is the fall of mankind. In that moment, in one sense as well, the evil one, the devil, who tempted them, by choosing his temptation of pride, we join humanity and even the physical created world joins the camp of the evil one. Jesus often refers to Satan in the scriptures, to the devil, as the Lord of this world in the Gospels. And what that means is the one to whom this world was given by our free choice to turn away from God. God respected our free will. We were always free to love him or not. God is still, ultimately the Lord of everything. He's still the creator, and in the end, goodness wins. But by our choice, by the choice of the original sin, which affects every single subsequent human being, which is why human beings have such a hard time avoiding sin. We call that concupiscence, which is the gradual leaning towards sin, the turning away from each other in conflict and turning away from God. In doing that broken relationship then creates a tragedy in which we ourselves could never save ourselves. Once we had turned away from God with the original sin, and sin affected the human race, by our own choice, we were sort of cut off from that union that we had with him at the beginning. And here's where we get into this salvation history. Because what does it mean to have salvation? It means you're being saved from something. What are we being saved from? The condition of sin and the punishment. We say punishment for sin, but really the result of sin, which is death. So at that moment, God then, allowed us to exist in the world that we had chosen, which was a broken world, which included death, the separation of our soul from our body, and which includes pain and suffering and misery and all those things. That's what we're being saved from. But it's important to remember that we were not created in that condition. It was chosen by the original sin, which we all inherited from Adam and Eve. Now here comes the good news. It doesn't stop here. So what God does then is, right there in chapter 3 of Genesis, right when we have the fall, he gives us the promise. The promise, basically, without getting into the whole verse there, is God tells Satan, he's speaking to the serpent, and he basically says, your kingdom that you have just gained because they chose you over me, your kingdom will come to an end. I will send one to crush your head, is basically what he says, through a woman. Importantly, that phrase, the woman, he's not referring to Eve. He's referring to a future condition here. One will come who will destroy your dominion and who will undo this original sin. That promise of salvation then is going to be the seed that is planted that we're going to watch slowly develop. And that's important here. But alongside it, we will also watch what sin does to the human race. And the very first thing I said that it does is it destroys our relationship with nature. So Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden. No longer will they have their food in harmony with the plants and the animals. That now they must work by, as it says, the sweat of their brow. They must cultivate the earth. And their life is one of difficulty, of trying to sustain themselves and stay alive. The next thing then that happens in sin, chapter 4, so after the harmony with nature is broken, now we talk about the relationship that we have with one another being broken. Chapter 4 is the first murder in the human race, and it happens from Adam and Eve's children. They had 2 children at first, Cain and Abel. Obviously, they had many more children. All of us, in some sense, are their children. All of us are sons of Adam and daughters of Eve, but their first children, Cain and Abel, so we can see the human race here growing. But of course, sin affected us at the very beginning, at the very start of the branch. Cain ends up killing Abel, and it's another long story. But the sin here it's always pride. Pride always underlies everything. But Cain is jealous of Abel because Abel seems to have found favor with God more than Cain. So jealousy and envy also come into play. So we can see then in the first murder that we have also turned from each other. Now, and if you're following along with the handout that's on this website, that's on our parish website titled Salvation History, what we're talking about here then, this salvation seed that's planted is given to one holy couple, Adam and Eve. Now we're going to, as we go through Genesis and the Old Testament, that promise is going to gradually expand. These covenants are going to expand to be all and more inclusive, so that more and more people have access to salvation and the relationship with God, which was lost. So from one holy couple, let's move to one holy family, Genesis chapter 6. And this is where we meet Noah, generations after Adam and Eve. And Noah, the important part of Noah's story, again, is not so much to look at the ark and all the animals on the ark of the covenant, the ark, which then survived the flood. The important thing here is to realize is that Noah maintains that promise, and the world is washed clean with a flood. Showing that sin has sort of created a condition in which, we're so unclean, if you will, so far from where God wants us to be, that the world is washed clean with a flood. Again, the historical fact of this happening or not is not the important part here. It's the truth that we draw from it. This, of course, will represent baptism. Baptism is when we are washed clean with water so that we can have this new covenant with God, which is expanded to us. Noah and his family survive the flood. They then begin again to grow, to grow and expand, so that the world can continue to have this promise of salvation, even as sin still exists. The flood was a symbolic washing of the world. It was not a literal destruction of sin, because sin still existed after this flood had happened. And in fact, after the flood, we come to Genesis chapter 11, and we have sort of the climax of the story of sin, which is the Tower of Babel. So again, the human race has turned from God. They have turned against each other, and this culminates when we try and be so much like God that we build a tower, it is said, and this tower sort of represents our own ingenuity to try and do things on our own, to create our own world. We build this tower to reach to the heavens, to literally storm heaven and become like God. It's the same sort of thing that Adam and Eve in eating the apple. Pride makes us think that we don't need him, that we can do it on our own. And it's at Babel then that the languages of the world are confused, that the division of sin is shown to literally make it so we can't even talk to each other anymore. To literally make it that we are torn apart and separated in all of this. But the promise of salvation remains. Because the very next chapter, chapter 12, is where we meet Abraham, who we often refer to as our father in faith. Abraham expands from one holy couple, Adam and Eve, to one holy family, Noah and his family, to one holy tribe. Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham, as the song goes. And his family then, as his sons take wives and have families, it becomes sort of a small tribe of people who continue this tradition. Abraham was a descendant of Noah, who, like all of us, was a descendant of Adam. Abraham receives anew this promise, this covenant, as it continues to expand, now to the size of a tribe. The story of Abraham is important in as much as we see in chapter 21 in Genesis, as we go forward through Abraham's story, which I won't get into right now. You can read it yourself if you'd like to read the whole story. Abraham's son Isaac, God told him that that I would like you to make a sacrifice to me. And by the way, this begins to show us the importance of that concept of sacrifice, which is a means by which we offer back to God what belongs to him. It's a way to undo that sense of pride, because again, we're not the masters, we're not the creator, we're the creatures. A sacrifice is when we offer something to God, which belongs to him anyways, as a show that we worship him and honor him and acknowledge that he is the Lord of all. But God tells Abraham in a test to sacrifice his son, Isaac. Now, at this point in the human condition, in the human race, Abraham was just one tribe. Everyone, we believe, had descended from Adam and Eve. But Abraham was just one tribe among many kingdoms, and the world itself was this is generations and generations later. And so human sacrifice, unfortunately, was not all that uncommon. The world was so broken by sin that even religion itself, which is that remnant of the knowledge of that relationship we have with God, took on many grotesque forms. It was acknowledged that offering a sacrifice was something we should do for the divine, but it had been so clouded over by sin that human sacrifice in the ancient religions was not uncommon. So Abraham takes Isaac, sadly, to follow God's command. Now, as the story goes, he never intended Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. What he wanted to do was to show how faithful he was. Isaac is spared, and instead a ram is given to him to offer in sacrifice to God. An animal sacrifice is given. God, at that point, makes it clear that in true religion, which is one way that you can look at this covenant, which is expanding as this true religion, meaning the true knowledge of who God is and what he desires, true religion does not call for human sacrifice, but instead, offerings made to God can be represented with animals or with the first fruits of the harvest, with food and plants and things like that. And so it's important, and I know that the concept of animal sacrifice is is very ancient to us and very grotesque. And we'll look at how that develops and what that leads to, because it's pointing to something more full than, even beyond what it is. But we keep moving then to from Abraham. Once Isaac is spared, then Isaac becomes the principal heir, H-E-I-R, of Abraham. And Isaac has... sorry, I lost my place on my notes. Isaac then continues to carry on this lineage, and through him is born Jacob. And Jacob then becomes this sort of next step that we're going through as we go through Genesis, and so Jacob receives, he becomes the chief inheritor of his father Isaac in chapter 24 of Genesis. Why don't we just move all the way to chapter 32, in which Jacob is renamed Israel. And we're going to go from one holy tribe to one holy nation, in the nation of Israel here slowly. When Jacob is renamed Israel, and he is then known by Israel, and he has 12 sons, the 12 sons of Jacob become the 12 tribes of Israel. So from one tribe, these 12 tribes, which are united by their common father, Jacob, who is also known as Israel, this becomes the nation of Israel. You know, when tribes join together, they become a nation. So we've gone from one holy couple with the promise, Adam and Eve, to one holy family, Noah, to one holy tribe, and Abraham, now to one holy nation with Israel and his 12 sons. And that takes us basically to the end of Genesis, into the book of Exodus. Because of a famine, this one holy nation finds itself in another nation that's far from God, Egypt, under Pharaoh. And this is where we get the story of Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. If you've ever seen that famous play, Joseph is one of Israel's sons. The story of Exodus is how this one holy nation then gradually becomes one holy kingdom and establishes itself in its own land. The nation of Israel at this point, these united tribes, these 12 tribes that are united, are under the ruler. They're under the rule of Pharaoh in Egypt, and they must be freed from this. How is it that they are freed? Again, by water. The important thing here is water. God comes, he sends Moses to them so God himself, comes to their aid and sends Moses, and without telling the entire story of Exodus, Moses gets them out of Egypt through the Red Sea. He parts the Red Sea. They go through. Again, water is used as the symbol for the covenant of salvation, of getting away from slavery to Pharaoh, or if you will, slavery to sin, and into the promised land, which becomes the land of Israel. And so if we skip, so there's other books then after Exodus, the book of Numbers, the book of Deuteronomy, which talk about the Jewish people as they leave Egypt, wander through the wilderness. The book of Leviticus talks about the priestly tradition of the Jewish people and the development of their worship and their sacrifices, which again orients them to God, slowly developing until finally we'll skip ahead to the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, in which Israel establishes itself as a kingdom in a specific place, in what we now call the nation of Israel, what the Romans called Palestine, in the Middle East, on the far east side of the Mediterranean Sea, with Jerusalem as their capital. David is the first king of united, Saul is their first king, but he loses favor with God. David becomes the first true king of all of Israel. So we've gone from one holy couple to one holy family to one holy tribe to one holy nation of united tribes to one holy kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. And the rest of the narrative parts of the Old Testament tell us the story of that kingdom. There are many events that we don't have time to get into. They go into exile. They are conquered by Babylon because they turn from God. The story here is constantly one of God establishing himself as their leader and giving them this, reminding them of this promise, this salvation that had all the way back from Adam and Eve, to them forgetting this, turning from him. Sin shows its ugly face, and then they are punished and they are brought back. That's the story, the cyclical story of the Old Testament. It's in this context then, and we believe it to be many, many years after King David, that, and possibly then even, close to 1,000 years after King David, that we, in this kingdom of Israel, which has then been conquered again by the Romans, that we have the birth of Christ. Now is when we get from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and Christ himself is born in, how we would say 2,020 years ago, roughly, in the kingdom of Israel. Again, no longer under their own rulership. They still have a king named Herod, but they are really under the rule of Caesar, the emperor in Rome. Now is the point, though, where we're going to sort of stop the historical narrative and pick it up again when we talk about Christ and the birth of the church. But it's important here to see what happens in the birth of Christ. If you remember, way back in the very beginning, when God is giving what we call the proto-gospel, the first instance of the good news, to Adam and Eve, he tells them there will be a woman and her child will will crush the head of the serpent. Now we come to the woman, who we believe to be Mary. Her son, Jesus, is the one promised to come and undo this original sin. Who is it that has to undo original sin? God himself. Christ, as we've talked about, we believe to be truly God himself in the flesh. And at the same time, then, what Christ is going to do is he's going to take this one holy kingdom and establish the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Keep in mind the word Catholic means universal. So we've gone from a couple to a family, to a tribe, to a nation, to a kingdom, to the universal church, which can encompass the entire human race. Anyone can be a part of the church. And so God's plan that the human race could be in union with him and that we would be in harmony with one another and with God, that is fulfilled, that can be fulfilled in the church. The condition of sin is not removed. We are still affected by sin, but we finally now have the remedy. All of the sacrifices of the Old Testament, of the priestly tradition of the Jewish people, from when Isaac was replaced with the ram, through all of that, and eventually they settled the location for these sacrifices at the temple, which was in Jerusalem. All of that was pointing to the one true sacrifice made by Christ on the cross. When Christ dies on the cross, all of the Old Testament is fulfilled. And when he rises from the dead, then what happened at the original sin, we are given the chance to have its remedy. We can be forgiven of sin because of what Christ did, because of Christ's death on the cross. And when we talk about the Eucharist, we'll get into this much more because this is sort of our means of partaking in it. But the important thing, salvation history culminates in the birth of Jesus. Just as creation culminated in the creation of Adam and Eve. In many ways, Jesus becomes our new Adam and Mary becomes our new Eve. That just but Jesus is the divine Adam. He is the divine man. And so unlike the original parents, Mary says yes to God's plan instead of saying yes to the temptation of the evil one. And Jesus fulfills what is promised in dying for us, taking on the punishment, death itself, and then rising, breaking the punishment forever, breaking its power forever. So again, we'll talk more about that when we talk about the Eucharist and what the Eucharist really is. This kind of gets us to where the next time that I teach, which hopefully will be in person, it won't be next week, but at some point in person, we'll talk about church history, which is the development of the church. And we'll see the church grow and the church take in more and more. But it's important to remember that we are now in the point of salvation history where we can become a part of the church and inherit the fullness of the promise. And then we look forward to the culmination of everything at the apocalypse. The apocalypse itself means the unveiling. It means, in other words, to be revealed, which is why we call it the book of Revelation. That is when Christ will come back, and that is when we will regain the complete and total harmony that we once had in Eden with the world. The world will be remade. Our relationship with each other and with God will be firmly established once and for all as it was meant to be, free of sin. Those who do not choose to be a part of that, those who choose to turn from God, are given their choice, and the result of that choice is what we call damnation or hell. For those who choose to be with him, that choice is also then given to them, that we can unite ourselves with them and join the angels, and that then becomes salvation, becomes heaven, the new heaven and the new earth. Those who are in hell, by the way, those who are separated, their choice to join the fallen angels is made complete in that. So that is sort of a very, very rough rendering of salvation history, a gradual expanding of God's promise of salvation after the original sin until it culminates in Jesus. The Old Testament then for us is very important because not only does it connect us to our Jewish brothers and sisters who hold the Old Testament as the fullness of their scripture, but it also gives us the context in which God prepared the human race for his son to come through the Jewish people. Jesus was born a Jew in Israel. and that this one true religion was maintained as an island in darkness in a world so affected by sin until it could be unlocked and become the church, which then becomes the light for the world. So we'll talk about that more next time. I know this is a lot to take in. Feel free to watch the video to sort of go through the books. On the handout, I have the important books of the Old Testament and the verses that we're talking about here. But I think the important thing to see here is that salvation history means that, yes, as a human race, we fell, but God never gave up on us. And in God's time and in his plan, all things always come to their proper end. And that is very good news. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. And again, I'd appreciate your prayers that I do not end up contracting the coronavirus. So far, so good. This is the precautionary self-quarantine, but I will be back with you next time we have class, God willing. Have a good night.